And the other one is North-South solidarity is crucial in this regard to put pressure on the US, European Union, Wall Street, and European commercial creditors with a call to re-roll the Jubilee. It is also important to denaturalize obligation to repay and politicize calls to debt cancellation and default. As the government tightened its belt to play into the tune of multilateral lenders and its ability to deliver public goods and services over the years declined, predatory lending like microfinance stepped in to fill the vacuum. Today, a group of women protesting microfinance debt in Sri Lanka also holds the light, a lesson for the government to embrace in its fight with unpayable public debt. A woman involved in the protest told me, call to default microfinance debt in 2018 provided us a breathing space. Before that, we were trying to debt repayment by even foregoing food. I had considered suicide a number of times, she said. Let's replicate the unilateral debt suspension that states across the world adopted in 1930s in the aftermath of the last epidemic, Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. I'm done with my presentation. I can take up questions if you have later. Thank you.
Thank you, Amali, so much for bringing us the Sri Lankan story, which is, of course, something that many of us are familiar with. But we must remember that in the pandemic, many of us southern countries are going to be pushed over the abyss in terms of poverty and real need. And I think this impending debt crisis, you talked of a four-pronged approach. We will go to our next speaker, and I hope he will tell us something about approaches that they have tried in the Philippines. He has been involved in many campaigns in his country associated with debt audit, and looking at projects financed by IFIs. We know that what IFIs have done, tried to come in talking of being the saviors for our countries, has not really panned out in that manner. There is much that we must hold them accountable for, together with, of course, our own borrowing country governments. But Rovik Obanil from Freedom from Debt Coalition Philippines is program staff for essential services. He also monitors the ADB together with other projects in his country. And it would be really useful, Rovik, if you told us about debt audits and debt cancellations, because an immediate suspension in the context of the severe multiple crises that we are facing in the South would be a good way forward. I think it would open up much needed resources for important things like healthcare and social protection. Rovik?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Vidya. I am Rovik from the Freedom from Debt Coalition. The Freedom from Debt Coalition is a movement of over 200 organizations from the local all the way to the national. And we have been campaigning around the debt issue since the mid-1980s. We are also part of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. But I wasn't there in the 1980s. I just like to clarify. Anyway, I have a short presentation that I'd like to share.
Please do tell us. Great. We can.
Can you see it now?
Perfect. Would you make it full screen, please?
Yeah, wait. Oops. Okay. This is basically, this was a situationer that I gave to another group previously. So this basically I just modified the presentation for this discussion. So I would like to begin with a short trip down memory lane. In the 1980s, after many years of economic mismanagement and corruption, the Philippine economy found itself in a very bad state. So, in October 1983, the Philippines declared the beginning of a series of 90-day moratoriums on principal payments for external debts. We were forced to carry out a very stringent, very harsh IMF adjustment program. Many of you probably know this. And of course, the costs were substantial. Between 1983 to 1986, real per capita income dropped by 18%. There was widespread poverty and hunger in many parts of the country. And as you can imagine, the deteriorating economy led to massive unrest, and along with broad dissatisfaction among the middle class and the business sector, this basically contributed to the downfall of the then 20-year Marcos dictatorship. So fast forward about, a little over 3 decades, and the prevailing government narrative is now that debt is no longer an issue. This narrative has become so pervasive, in fact, that we routinely get called out by the media. For example, whenever we bring up the debt issue, they used to say, the government's saying that it's no longer a problem, that we can manage whatever debt we take on. Of course, this was in 2019, prior to what happened in 2020. This is a statement by our senior economic managers during a meeting with the country's top business executives. So that's basically the theme of the narrative. So, and they keep extolling that the GDP growth of the Philippines is very strong, 6.6 from 2016 to 2019, one of the strongest, not just in the region, but in the world. The debt to GDP ratio had been reduced to 39.6%, the lowest on record. We had just recently, at that time, received a ratings upgrade to BBB+, which was the highest in the country's history. Our revenues were at 16.1%, the highest in over 2 decades, and inflation was kept within the target range. So this is a very rosy picture that they were painting of the country's economy. Of course, we all know what happened after that. COVID-19 came along, and the problems really surfaced. So basically, the pandemic demolished the government's rosy narrative of perpetually improving macroeconomic fundamentals for the country. And at the end of 2019, the country's outstanding debt, which stood at the end of 2019, the debt stood at $161 billion. But by the end of 2020, it had ballooned to $204.17 billion, which represented an increase of 27%. And the debt was recorded at 224. So it again increased to $224.45 billion. This is as of the end of January 2021. In fact, the current administration's borrowing spree in the last year represents the largest annual addition to our country's debt. And that's not all. We have seen a drop in revenues. You will recall that earlier I was saying I showed you that the government was extolling the increased revenues, but of course in 2020 revenue dropped to 59.5 billion. Even the Internal Revenue Service, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, it was 32% lower. The customs revenues were also lower. And the record-breaking deficit, which was at 28.5 billion dollars in 2020, was more than double the previous year's deficit and represented 7.6% of the GDP. And unless we see a reversal of this downward trend in revenue generation, or we find alternative fund sources, the financing to plug these deficits and to fund COVID response and recovery will continue to be sourced from loans. And for this year alone, our Department of Finance's borrowing target is another $63.125 billion. And of course, like many countries in 2020, we saw a dramatic spike in our debt to GDP ratio. You will recall earlier that I told you government was proclaiming that it had reduced the debt to GDP, and it was the lowest on record, but that has effectively been reversed. And the projection is that this will continue this year and at least until 2022. So we have really seen a surge in borrowing in the past year. But even before that, under the current administration, it was already on the rise. And you can see in this chart how much the current administration has added to the country's debt. And of course, as always, it's the poor who suffer the most. During the pandemic, basically the pandemic put a spotlight on the depth of mass poverty and unemployment in the country. The long lines of like these people, desperate people who queued up under the summer heat and risk potential infection. These people were hoping to get some monetary assistance. And this is undeniable evidence of the problem in the country. So this has prompted the question, are we facing another development catastrophe in the making? One of the problems is, despite the increase in borrowing, one of the questions we need to ask is, what is it being used for? Despite the surge in borrowing, there has been little increase in social infrastructure spending. And in fact, the proposals coming out of our Congress, for example, these legislative proposals that you see here are really supposedly economic recovery bills, but are in fact little more than measures aimed at attracting big investors and bailing out large businesses. For example, this CREATE law is going to give corporations a big tax cut. And this is in stark contrast, to the limited support that the Filipino masses have been getting. They've been practically left to fend for themselves, and we still have a problem with the vaccines. I'm sure you've heard about that. So with debt spiking, revenues falling, budget deficit widening, the country appears to be headed to another crisis period similar to the 1980s. What FTC is asking is, where is the development framework in all of this? Debt is rising everywhere, all over the globe. But where is the development framework? Many of the programs currently being drafted are based on the neoliberal thinking, will actually lead to deepening inequality. Some examples I already showed you, those laws, which are not going to help the poor in our country, but are actually going to benefit the corporations, the wealthy. And the failure to put forward more ambitious, inclusive, and system-changing solutions will severely impact not just the lower and middle-income countries, but in fact the entire planet. And the prevailing thinking remains focused on maintaining and sustaining the existing debt infrastructure and the creditor-debtor relations that have actually kept countries poor. I think it's also important to point out that the aversion to novel solutions, out-of-the-box solutions, is not limited to lenders. In fact, when we talk about, for example, when we call for debt relief or debt cancellation in our country, the first people who will oppose it are the people in our government. because they are so afraid, of risking the supposedly good credit ratings that the Philippines has been getting. But this is precisely the time to push for bold solutions so that this crisis is not wasted. That's what we think. So how do we climb out of this pit? First of all, a debt moratorium will not be enough because it merely postpones the payment of debt. And obviously, this COVID problem and the other crises that it has spawned, as well as the other crises that we are facing, climate and all that stuff, will not go away in a couple of years. And we need all the funding, the resources that we can get in order to deal with them. And debt cancellation also cannot be limited only to the poorest countries, as even middle-income countries. The Philippines, for example, is supposed to be a middle-income country now, and even middle-income countries are struggling. Another thing is that cannot be the default source of financing for addressing the multiple crises we are facing. In the Philippines, for example, we are not just looking at external sources and not just looking at debt. We are actually pushing for other sources of financing. That should not be the go-to solution, and FDC has put forward some proposals of where these alternative financing sources are to be found. Maybe I can elaborate on that later when we have the discussion. We are also, FDC is also campaigning, it's just begun a campaign for a wealth tax in our country. And we need it not just to fund the current COVID response, but to finance an actual transformation. So transformation is the key. We can't just go back to business as usual. We can't use these funds just to build back to where we were before, because that exactly is a problem. And we believe there needs to be a stimulus program that is centered on the people and is crafted with the participation of the people. A stimulus program, we call it the People's Stimulus Program. This is an initiative that we just recently also launched. It will not just address the issue of survival, but also of sustainability and addressing, the huge problem of inequality.
You're completely out of time, actually. Yeah. How many slides more do you have?
This is the last slide, sorry.
Okay, quickly.
I wasn't able to see the chat. Okay. Forgive me. Anyway, so another proposal that we have actually had some success with is with a debt audit. So in 2016, FTC campaigned for a debt audit we identified 20 cases of illegitimate debts, foreign debts that we found to be illegitimate. We submitted this to policymakers. We lobbied with lawmakers, and two senators passed a resolution in 2016 calling for an audit of official development assistance. And on December 22, 2016, the president signed the budget law, which includes a special provision for a conduct of a debt audit on the 20 illegitimate loans that we identified. So it can actually be done. It was the first time, it's actually the first time that a debt audit was taken seriously and was included in legislation in the Philippines. So I'm sorry if I surpassed my time allocation. I will be ready to answer questions later. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rovik. That was an interesting presentation. And I think that pretty successful debt audit is also sort of hopefully a harbinger of many more. Interesting concepts there thrown up, and the call for a transformation financial transformation after this particular crisis, and the fact that you need stimulus packages which are very, very people-centered. Otherwise, what we are seeing across our countries, not just in yours, Rovik, for example, even in mine, that economic recovery or stimulus packages being put forth by the government now are only, aiding corporations and businesses, not really offering social protection for those that need it most in this time, not really seeing that our health system is beefed up. I think your presentation leads us very nicely to our final presentation, where Eric Toussaint, who is a historian and really celebrated political scientist and spokesperson for CADTM International, will take us through his ideas. And these are ideas that he has wrestled with and pushed governments at for many, many years. He's taken part in the process that launched the World Social Forum in 2001. Since 2010, he has been involved in citizens' debt audit initiatives across Europe, in Greece, Portugal, Spain, France, and Belgium. And thereafter, he's been consulted by parliaments in Brazil, Greece, Argentina. Eric Toussaint has also been the scientific coordinator of the Truth Committee on the Greek public debt, which was set up and later terminated by the president of the Hellenic Parliament. Eric, we're waiting to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to participate to this panel. Beginning mentioning that I sent to you in the chat 2 links with 2 documents, recent documents. We have produced them last year as an initiative from Europe to elaborate common proposal with activists from the Global South about what a progressive, what a leftist government coming to the power in Europe should do in relation with several items, and including the question of the debt, but also the question of migration, the question of wars, international policy in general, etc. It's clear that Europe is an important player inside the World Bank, inside the IMF, inside regional banks like the European Bank of Investment, but also ADB. As you know, several European countries are part of the Asian Development Bank, but also African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. And it is clear that the European powers are intervening in this institution to protect the interest of the capitalist classes in Europe, the big corporation, big European corporation, and ex-colonial powers. It's clear that when France is intervening in, for instance, in West Africa, it is intervening like neo-colonial power. And for instance, it has imposed a common money for West African French-speaking countries, the CFA, which is controlled by the Bank of France and the government of France. So we have to, as CADTM, we are denouncing Europe as an imperialist actor in relation to the global South. We are also underlining the negative intervention of European countries inside the Paris Club. Because I mentioned the multilateral banks in which European countries are part, but also European countries are players inside the Paris Club. And for several poor countries of the South, the Paris Club is an important protagonist of imposing neoliberal policy in complicity with the IMF and the World Bank. Europe is also playing a very bad role inside the United Nations system. Remember the year 2015, countries like Argentina, supported by South Africa, asked for the adoption of a resolution of the United Nations about the restructuration of debt. And it was voted. This resolution was adopted by more than 135 countries. But all European countries vote either against, with the US and Israel, or vote abstention. So saying that the UN system is not the good place to discuss this type of question, the debt restructuration, and affirming that the IMF is a good place to resolve question of debt restructuration, when we know that when the IMF is intervening, is always to impose neoliberal policy against the people. Speaking about the current situation, it is absolutely clear that inside the WTO, the European countries are opposing the proposal made by India and South Africa and other countries to waive the patent on the vaccines. I think that Biden made the turn in favor of waiving the patents, knowing perfectly that Europe will oppose. So he is the good cop, and Merkel and Macron are the bad cops. It's a calculation between them. And so Biden is not so sympathetic as some people think. But it is clear that European countries are now, European government are now fully responsible for blocking, stopping the possibility for countries like India, South Africa, and a lot of other countries who are capable to produce vaccines against COVID-19, and they are stopping this possibility, blocking this possibility, and we have to denounce that. And of course, we have to support any proposal of not only complete suspension of payment of the debt, but also cancellation of all the debt incurred to struggle against this pandemic. Of course, we think that it would not be enough. We are in favor of the repudiation of illegitimate debt and odious debt. But at least at the beginning, as Rovid said, we cannot support the present initiative of the IMF and the G20 in favor only of postponement of debt payment. We are in favor of full cancellation of the debt and beginning with the debt incurred to finance the struggle against the pandemic. In the document I refer to, we are making a series of recommendations. At the same time, they can be not only recommendations, but demands. So to finish, I will read this recommendation, but if you open the link, you will find it at the end of the article about debt. So we say that in order to cancel the illegitimate and odious debts claimed from third world countries, and thus promote sovereign solidarity-based and self-centered forms of development of the countries of the South, the governments of European countries should, without any form of interference, undertake to strictly respect the primacy of human rights over all other rights, oppose the systematic promotion of the private sector to finance the development of countries of the South, and in particular, oppose the promotion of public-private partnership. Third, cancel the support for the abusive microcredit system and its institution, favoring the replacement by genuine cooperatives managed by local population and by a public credit service granting loans at zero or very low interest rates. Fourth, put an end to neoliberal policies and the privatization of public services. Fifth, repeal a series of international, multilateral, and bilateral treaties that are contrary to the exercise of the full sovereignty of the states of the South and to the interest of the peoples of the South, and more broadly, to the general interest of humanity. Six, leave the international institution and other informal groups that, in essence, feed North-South asymmetries, including the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the Paris Club, the G7, and the G20. Seventh, leave regional development banks outside their borders. So Europe should leave the African Development Bank, should leave Asian Development Bank and Inter-American Development Bank. Eighth, join other countries of the South to create alternative multilateral international institutions that are democratic, equitable, and under popular control. Support the implementation of citizen audits on their territory in order to cancel debt claimed from third countries that have been identified as illegal, unsustainable, illegitimate, and or odious. Launch, do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. I am just concluding. Launch a vast audit program with citizen participation to highlight all forms of spoliation and exploitation of the peoples of the South. Impose heavy fines on corporations that have plundered the people of the South in various forms in order to contribute financially to a special aid and compensation fund. Finance the countries of the South, excluding official development assistance, by means of zero interest loans, repayable in full or in part in the currency desired by the debtor country. Make available to the population of the countries of the South through the association, autonomous organization, all documents, including those classified as defense secret, that can shed light on the origin of the debt reclaimed by various creditors. Regularly make public all claims against third parties in an easily accessible and comprehensible form. Expropriate ill-gotten goods by the rulers and ruling classes of the South and return them to the population concerned and under their control. Issue an official public apology for all the wrongdoings committed by European powers towards the population of the South, entitling them to reparation. Affirm the right to reparation and or compensation to peoples who were victims of colonial plunder and spoliation through the debt mechanism. Acknowledge the ecological debt of industrialized country to the countries of the South and make reparation and or compensation by recovering the cost of these expenses through a tax or fines levied on the large corporation responsible for pollution. Heavily punish companies guilty of any form of corruption by public officials of the countries of the South. Sanction senior official and political personnel who in European countries have favored or are favoring the spoliation in various forms of the people of the South. And I finished. Heavily sanctioned banks, including withdrawal of banking licenses. So heavily sanctioned banks that launder dirty money and are complicit in tax evasion, capital flight, and spoliation of the population of the South. These are our recommendations. We think that a common basis between people of the South, organization of the South, and of the global North to struggle together for the emancipation of the people of all the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. I think that those calls made out from this forum, it's very apt because the AEPF does bring together peoples and civil society organizations from the global North with those of the global South in great solidarity and over so many years. We'll jump right away into the question answer, and we've had a few questions coming to some of our panelists. I'll begin with you, Amali, and Qazi Zavid Pasha writes that his country, Bangladesh, has also been passing through a similar situation as you in Sri Lanka. How do you explain, he asks, the middle income trap? How does debt repayment hamper basic services delivery in Sri Lanka? Amali?
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Kazi, for the question. I think as many middle-income countries trapped in this, the middle-income trap illustrates, it's not actually the status, despite the status of our countries. If you look at the whole, like the majority of the population is still outside, unable to access access to education, healthcare, and social security. And what this obsession and playing into the rhetoric of debt repayment has been crippling. As Sri Lanka has seen, I think Sri Lanka has had a strong public education and health system in South Asia because of the heavy state investments over the years. But since 1977, the neoliberal open market policies have gradually crippled these institutions, and so that's what we are seeing. And I think that's the huge problem. I think we need to really, how do we fight against it? I think we need to, unite all the social forces. Students in Sri Lanka, students have been at the forefront in saving public or strengthening and safeguarding public education system. And now we are at a health crisis. We clearly see the importance of a public health system, a stronger public health system. There were nationalizing calls to nationalize hospitals in Europe, I think in Spain, if I remember correctly. So I think we need to really take cue from these struggles and unite in a time of crisis.
Thank you, Amali. Yes, a crisis is an opportunity, but of course, capitalists also really make hay every time there's a crisis. But it's a time to come together stronger than before and push harder. I'll go to Rovik. There's a question directed at you, Rovik. And the question is, what is the most negative impact of debt conditionality in your economy? And what are the development initiatives? Remember, you spoke about development framework in the face of rising debt, that we needed a new development framework. Maybe you can also talk of that, Rovik.
Yes, but before that, I'd just like to add something to the question that was earlier asked. Because the Philippines has an automatic appropriations law. I think the only country in the world that has something like that. The law basically says that debt payments get the first cut of the budget pie. Every time the government makes a budget, the first cut is appropriated for debt payments. So you can just imagine that there used to be a time when I think something like 40% of the budget went to debt servicing. So you can just imagine how little was left for social programs. So it's really a big problem. With regard to the question that was directed to me, basically the largest impact was that we were forced to implement neoliberal policies. Privatization, deregulation, liberalization. So it started us down the path to the privatization of essential public services. And two of the immediate targets were the power sector and the water sector. At the time, the largest water service provider, which serviced Metro Manila, was public. Unfortunately, the MWSS and the National Power Corporation were also the two largest contributors to the national debt. So they were targeted. The MWSS was privatized, and of course, assets were sold off. And two laws were passed on water and one for the power industry. And now we struggle with some of the highest rates for power and water, not just in the region, I think, but in the entire world. We also implemented a liberalization program, trade liberalization. We implemented a series of we were forced to implement a series of tariff reform programs, which basically can be described as programs of unilateral disarmament. We removed most of the protections. We lowered the tariffs on most commodities. We removed the protection, and there was also very little support for domestic agriculture and industry. So we simply could not compete with other countries, including some of the promoters of liberalization like the United States, who were heavily subsidizing their producers. So our agriculture sector, which then represented over a third of the economy, is now less than 10%, I think. So it really resulted in a hollowing out of these sectors, agriculture and industry. And it has basically stunted Philippine development.
Yes, we can imagine, with 40% going towards debt servicing at one time. I hope not now. A quick question to Eva. If you can unmute yourself. The Greek and Ecuador audit experiences, if you could talk a little about them and tell us how the audit process can actually empower communities. How powerful is the audit as a tool? Is the debt audit as a tool?
Yes, okay. So about the experience of the audit, I think it's a necessary tool. First of all, what I've seen from my own experience in Greece is that debt is also making a lot of confusion, popular confusion. Like you don't know what you pay, for who you pay, and everybody tells you you have to pay because you are responsible for what's happening to you. You are responsible for the crisis, for the fact that the economy is not going well, that the people around don't have jobs, and etc. And so there was this confusion I've seen from my family also, and from my friends, and from other people that were living in Greece at that time. And I felt that audit was had this purpose as one of them, not the only one, but one of them was to break this confusion and to make the light on the real responsibilities. But also the other objective of an audit is of course to know what's happening with the money, why we are in debt, to whom, in which conditions, for what. And it's necessary because of the fact that public expenditure is supposed to go to those who pay it for the people, and for assuring their basic human rights. So a debt audit is a tool that assures that the public expenditure goes to what it should go to, and not for financing financial actors. So corporations and all the actors that were told before by my comrades. So that's it. And finally, the ultimate purpose of an audit is, of course, to cancel the illegitimate part of public debt and illegitimate.
Absolutely. And to showcase that this part is actually illegitimate. I think probably an audit really helps with that, and yes, to galvanize the community around that. Thank you, Eva. Because we are fast running out of time, I'll go to the final question, which is directed at Eric, unless, of course, somebody puts in another pressing question. The question, again, from Bangladesh is, what is the characteristic difference between a European lender and an Asian lender? That's an interesting question for most of us.
Okay.
And Eric, we want you to answer.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that it depends, because, you know, in some way, Japan as a creditor is playing the same policy as Germany or France or or England or Belgium, because they are big, old colonial powers. They have the corporation, so they impose to the debtors a contract in which the money which is lent should be used to buy product exported by this country. And in some way, China is reproducing this type of policy and also controlling a strategic part of infrastructure of different countries. It's clear in Sri Lanka, it is clear in Pakistan. China has a strategy of promoting corridors, as they say, which allows them as the main now economy in the world to receive commodities and to export its product to the world market. And the debt is part of this strategy. So I think that, of course, if you speak about the policy of a country of India, it could be in some way different. But India, in relation with its neighbors, try to reproduce this type of policy also with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, and so with Maldives, etc. So I think that the main problem is the imposition from big countries, big powers, big economies, of conditionalities, different type of conditionalities, because China is not imposing the same conditionality as the IMF. It is well known, but there are conditionalities. And so that the question is to denounce any form of any form used by any lender, either European or Asian, any form of domination or subordination, of imposition, of condition in the contract, who give a privilege to the creditors and his corporation. So I would not make a simplistic opposition between European countries as lenders and Asian countries. It depends of the Japan, China, India are countries which are in condition to reproduce what European powers are doing with the countries who are in debt with them. So we have to denounce any type of policies, neo-imperialist or imperialist policies.
Yes, thank you, Eric. We have another 2 questions here, maybe more. I think I'll put this to both Amali and Eric. It comes from David Otieno. And the question is, what is the link between microcredit and neoliberal policies of the IMF? And what alternatives exist or can be developed? Amali first, and then yes, we're getting a couple of more questions. Amali, and then Eric, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we should understand microfinance as a neoliberal moment, and kind of dissuade this illusion that microfinance presents a development. I mean, it's a tool of development. So in Sri Lanka, what was happening when Sri Lankan government adopted neoliberal policies from 1977, there was a gradual decline, withdrawal, and disinvestment of government funding in public services like education, health, and social security. And it also, I mean, so that goes, I think the privatization, I mean, the pressure of austerity and structural reforms, which accompanies like privatization of these very services that the government used to offer earlier. And the public's only way of financing these services then becomes debt. For the low-income women and, so finance, because they don't have access to credit from formal banks and finance institutions, microfinance has become the only resort to finance these services, regular services. And then there are other, fallouts, like because of the neoliberalization of agriculture, the industrialization of agriculture, and the fallouts like, the kidney problem and pollution, and people, then there are these escalating costs at individual levels. Again, put pressure on the household, and for the low-income women, microfinance has become a kind of a resort to finance them. And you see the debt. And the other, I think, is the financialization, and commercialization of finance and microfinance, which we have seen after 2000 in Sri Lanka. And I'm sure it is the case in other parts of the country and world as well, which further, neoliberalized this neoliberal tool by, allowing the capitalists to acquire higher profits by lending to the poor. So I think that's, and in Sri Lanka, the cooperatives have been part of the struggle against microfinance and try to promote as an alternative. And there are other, I think the principle, I think, with which everybody agrees, that the alternative should be, it's a form of credit owned by the people and controlled by the people at the village level, because the biggest issue we have seen with the microfinance is this level of extraction of wealth from the villagers, which has actually dispossessed and located the villagers, people, in a permanent state of dependency on debt. So I think it's alternative should be able to break this vicious cycle. So cooperatives at the moment, I think we can learn lessons from the cooperative experiences in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. Maybe we need to really develop the cooperative model. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Amali. That was very well explained, and it was a very what felt kind of answer. Eric, as you also tackle this, and I see that you have shared something that has been written on the IMF, inhuman at the micro and macro levels, in the chat. As you tackle this, I'd also put another question to you.
I can say very shortly something complementing what Amali just said. I agree with what they've said, Amali. Last year, I was in Sri Lanka, and of course in contact with Amali and several women organizations and social movement opposing microcredit. And I wrote an article about the policy of the IMF in relation with microcredit. And in Sri Lanka, the interest rate imposed by microcredit agency is absolutely scandalous. So thanks to the mobilization of women, and Amalie is very active in that, they succeeded to convince the government to fix a maximum interest rate of 35% on microcredit loans, which is already absolutely exaggerated. What I discovered is that the IMF, in his statement about that, said it should be phased out as soon as possible, because imposing such a limit is distorting the financial market. So the IMF is against the of maximum of interest rate. So for the IMF, your macrocredit agencies can ask 70%, no problem, of interest rate, because it is freedom of the market. And I have to say also, in the same article, I have written during my stay in Sri Lanka, I denounced the European Investment Bank, who is also subventioning private microcredit agencies in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. I should also say that in Europe, we have, in my country, Belgium and the Netherlands, there is a supposed ethic private bank. I don't know if you know this bank. Its name is Triodos, and it presents itself as an ethical bank. But when I analyze what this bank is doing in making investment in Sri Lanka and Cambodia, etc., it appears as that this supposed ethical bank, Triodos, is investing capitals in the bank named LOLC in Sri Lanka, which is the main enemy of the poor women in Sri Lanka, because this agency and elsewhere in the region, not only in Sri Lanka, is spoliating the poor people through microcredit. So we should be very aware of what is doing the IMF, the European Investment Bank, and supposed ethical banks who are all together participating to the expoliation of the poorest of the people of the global south. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. But I'm going to call you back on, because there are a couple of questions that are directed to you. But Amalie has her hand raised, and I think she wants to add a point. Would you do that quickly, Amalie?
Yeah, so to add to Eric's comment on the IMF statement on the government intervention in 2018, they also, I think, was not happy with the partial debt waiver that the government provided. And I think it also has contributed to this kind of naturalization of debt repayment and the debt morality for the states and for the people.
Yes, because these IFIs work in more ways than one. They affect how we think, our policies, and of course, our everyday lives. We have a couple of more questions, and I think Tilak Kariwasam from Sri Lanka. This is also addressed to you, Eric. He says that he agrees to your proposal. Why can't we propose one other point? That all donor countries agree to contribute 0.7 according to their own GDPs. And from that proposal, But from that proposal, it hasn't happened as promised. How do we demand to cut that total outstanding from donor countries as debt cancellation? There's another one coming your way from Hassan Mehdi in Bangladesh. Hi, Eric, good to see you after more than a year, but the Chinese financiers have no environmental or social standards, he says, which means no consideration of human rights, environmental equilibrium, or impact of the projects on the lives and livelihoods of people. So how do we tackle this? In Kenya, Habu Dorcas says, I agree with you, Eric. For instance, here in Kenya, the multinationals are giving farmers seeds on loans at very high interest, ending up in a vicious debt cycle. And in many cases, they are ending up committing suicide. And this is so akin to what is happening in our countries too, Habu. Eric, sorry, but you're back on.
Okay, very short. Of course, I agree with the demand saying that every northern countries should dedicate at least 0.7% of its GDP to offer help in form of donation, grants, not loans, because you know there is that's very tricky, because when the countries of the North are presenting the result of the supposed efforts in matter of ODA, official development assistance, they are including loans. So they show loans, lending money as something like a donation, but they demand a repayment and they ask for an interest rate. Of course, less than 1%, but it is an interest rate. They are gaining money. So it's not a real, they are not really helping the countries. They are also including other expenses. For instance, in Europe, in my country, in Germany, in France, people, refugees, jailed in camps here in Europe, the cost of these prisons are put or are considered in the budget of official development assistance. Also, the cost of expulsion of people from Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, the cost of expulsion of them is considered as official development assistance. So I say, of course, countries should dedicate 0.7% to help and to cooperate, and they should not involve or include in the calculation of the 0.7% of the 0.7% such type of expenses, which are inhuman. Okay, in relation with the question posed by Mehdi about China, I agree. We should demand the same thing in relation with China as we demand in relation with Great Britain, France, etc. Chinese lending and investment should be respecting the environment and also labor laws, etc. Of course. So we cannot exclude China from this type of demands we are expressing in front of the European countries. Okay, I hope that I have answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have another question from Habu Dorcas, and it's to Amali. Amali, the question is, worldwide, we know most of the microcredit institutions are targeting women. What actions have you taken to protect women, and what impacts have they brought to the people? And I think in the chat, Habu also shared about how, just a second, I'll bring that up. He says that in Kenya, they are working with other allied movements like Kenyan Peasants League to raise awareness of women in terms of the terms and conditions of microfinance loans, to translate it into an understandable language, because majority of the terms and conditions are in English, which many women in Kenya do not understand. And that's the work of the Kenya Debt Abolition Network. Amali.
Yeah, thank you, Abu, for the question. In Sri Lanka, this campaign, there have been several campaigns against microfinance, I think coming from 2017 onwards. All of them supported by various women's groups, cooperatives, and other, social activists, farmers, and fishers organizations like that. I have been part of it from 2019 as part of my own research work. And so we have been calling out microfinance and finance companies, exposing them, about their exploitation and expropriation of people, and various violence exerted on them. And another element is, I think, on the line of the Kenya Debt Abolition Network, we also conduct legal aid and legal counseling, because in Sri Lanka as well, many of the agreements are in English, a language that people cannot understand. And there are various, I think, legal issues in the agreements. So we are raising awareness among people. And another problem that in Sri Lanka we are facing now is that microfinance and finance companies are using the judiciary to force people to pay these unpayable debt. So we try to provide some legal aid. I think we are in the process of strengthening that work, mobilizing lawyers, and we are also exploring possibilities of assuming maybe a public interest litigation, kind of a common kind of, what do you call, one case, maybe, because fighting individual cases is not really, it's not beyond our capacity, and seems not realistic even, and even to fight the techno-legalistic workings of the judiciary, who subscribe to the debt morality very often. And the other element of our work is to mobilize for alternatives. And actually to kind of discuss, learn from the existing alternatives like the cooperative movement in Sri Lanka, and what has been happening in other countries. So I think I'm really looking forward to reach out and network with others working on microfinance, and we can, I think, maybe create a platform where we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've kept our panelists for a very long time, but they have kept us very, very engaged. And we should now, I think of closing. I think there's a very interesting little bit that our friend from Bangladesh, Qazi Khalid Pasha, has put. He shares that though getting microfinance, women in Bangladesh buy hens and then repay their loans by selling the eggs. No loss, no profit. But we all know who profits in this. So I think, thank you, Habu, for your questions. I think it's finally women who champion other women's causes. And we're very glad to have women like Eva and Amali leading from the front. Eric is strong support, and Rovik is the young person wanting to change the world and how it's run. I think we should reiterate that cancellation of all debt in the present context that we are living in. Cancellation of all debt in the global south is something that we strongly will continue to advocate, and also to carry out citizens' audits is our commitment. Our citizens' audits of public debt with the aim of repudiating illegal, illegitimate, odious, and unsustainable debts. This panel, not this planet, but this panel set out to expose really the inconsistencies and ineptitude of the powers that be, the globally powerful, the IFIs, and the international private creditors. And it looks forward towards coming to common solutions to the overwhelming debt crisis, so that it serves us not just to make it through this present crisis in dignity, but the many crises that have been affecting us for so long. In solidarity with all struggles, and we know that there are so many big and small struggles happening across the world. I thank all of you for joining us, and please continue to keep up the good fight wherever you are. Question and push back on illegitimate debts. And CADTM, Freedom from Debt Coalition, and NGO Forum on ADB will continue to be with you. Thank you for sharing your emails, those of you who have. We will definitely share the presentations with those of you who drop us your emails in the chat. Thank you again. And please join the other Asia-Europe People's Forum panels that are on from today until the 24th, I think. Is it the 24th? A good 7-8 days of thinking and discussing together, and hopefully coming up with some out-of-the-box answers that we can then implement wherever we work and live and love. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you. Thank you, Sushovan, for all the background work. Thank you for all those who joined us. We hope that we will meet in person next year or thereafter. Thank you.